They're American traditions everyone knows: Thanksgiving turkeys, 4th of July fireworks, and, if you're especially unlucky, an SUV parked sideways across your driveway. That was the welcome committee when I returned to my family's cabin after 3 weeks away, a gleaming silver Lexus, positioned with all the subtlety of a tombstone. I sat in my Ford truck, staring at it the way you stare at a locked bathroom door when you really have to go. Of course, the Lexus wasn't unclaimed. It belonged to Mrs. Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. She emerged wearing a red blazer so bright it could sear the retinas of passing birds. Her chin tipped up like she was about to conduct an auction on my gravel road. "You can't drive in here today," she said, voice thick as pudding skin. "We're having a community event. This road is for residents only." I laughed, not the kind of laugh you use at someone's tedious slideshow, but the deep, involuntary laugh you produce when you realize you've just stepped in dog poop wearing brand new shoes. "Ma'am," I said, "this is my land. That road you're standing on is also mine. If you don't move your Lexus, you'll find out exactly how much I value my driveway." Her eyes narrowed. She was measuring my patience like a tailor with a very small tape. "We all have to follow the rules. This isn't just about you. It's about the community." I stepped out of the truck, boots crunching against the gravel. "Your HOA rules don't apply here. You're trespassing." She lifted her phone like a pistol. "If you so much as touch my car, I'll call 911. I folded my arms. "Call them. I'll be waiting. Maybe they'll bring a tow truck." A gust from the lake stirred the branches overhead. For a moment, I thought she'd dial, but she didn't. She wasn't used to pushback. Most people, I imagine, folded the way you fold a fitted sheet, clumsily and with a sigh. But this land had been in my family for more than 60 years, and I had inherited not just the deed, but the stubbornness that came with it. I could have pressed the gas and flattened her Lexus into a shiny pancake, but my mother's voice piped up in my head. "Elliot, do you want to be the man who dies in a driveway accident? Or the man who at least makes it into the obituary section with some dignity?" So I turned the truck around, parked by the lake, and sulked. From that angle, I could still see the cabin's roofline peeking through the trees, as if mocking me. The cabin was supposed to be my refuge, the place where coffee tasted better, and the silence was thick enough to muffle the world. Instead, I was a man marooned 100 yards from his own porch. My dog sat in the passenger seat, staring at me with an expression that suggested disappointment. If dogs could talk, mine would have said, "Congratulations, you've lost a staring contest to a woman in a blazer." I offered him the last sip of coffee from my thermos. He refused. Even my dog knew it tasted like scorched rubber bands. I thought about every time I'd let Mrs. Whitmore win. The note she slipped under my gate: "Please mow your lawn. It looks unsightly. Your dog barks too much. Smoke from your fire pit is drifting toward the community." Each one written in a tone that suggested she was the human embodiment of a school principal. I always crumpled them up and shoved them into a drawer, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But now, staring at her Lexus barricade, I realized this was no longer about lawns or dogs or smoke. It was about boundaries, the kind that aren't discussed in therapy, but drawn in gravel, with old trucks and bad tempers. I got out of the Ford and walked up to her window. "Last chance, Mrs. Whitmore. Move the car." She lowered the glass halfway, as though I might breathe germs into her upholstery. "You think you can scare me? I'll call the police right now." I leaned close, smiling. "Wonderful. Ask them to bring a tow truck. I'll be here." Her cheeks flushed red, the same shade as her blazer. Her hand trembled on the phone, but she didn't dial. We stood there in silence, locked in a tableau worthy of a Renaissance painting: the idiot and the busybody. Eventually, I retreated to the truck. Night fell quickly, and I settled in beside the lake, the frogs croaking like a chorus of broken trombones. It was almost peaceful, if you ignored the fact that I was technically camping on my own property without permission from the queen of the cul-de-sac. I swatted mosquitoes, shoved a jacket under my head, and stared at the cabin across the water. The dog shifted in his seat, sighing heavily. It occurred to me that no man wakes up one day planning to sleep in his pickup truck, but somehow, through 1,000 small concessions, you find yourself exactly there, eaten alive by mosquitoes, drinking coffee older than your regrets, while a Lexus guards your front porch. Tomorrow, I told myself. I'd stop being polite. I'd stand my ground. Then again, tomorrow, I might just reheat the same old coffee and reread the passive-aggressive notes she'd left all summer. Both options seemed equally likely. The morning after my driveway exile began with a mosquito bite on my eyelid, a stiff neck, and the unmistakable sense that I'd already lost a fight I hadn't technically finished. My big promise, the night before tomorrow, I'll stop being polite translated. In reality, to me sitting on the porch with reheated coffee, shuffling through a stack of notes Mrs. Whitmore had left on my gate over the past year. It was less revolution and more paperwork review, which, in its own way, felt like defeat. The first note in the pile read, "Please paint your barn to match community standards." My barn was built by my grandfather in 1962, when community standards meant don't leave an open flame next to the gas tank. The barn had survived storms, termites, and my uncle's attempt to turn it into a disco in the 70s. Mrs. Whitmore wanted it beige, because apparently beige is the sacred color of order. Another read, "Your dog barks too much at night." My dog, a mostly deaf mutt named Franklin, was asleep beside me, snoring like a congested grandfather. The accusation felt like telling Beethoven he was too loud. Then there was my personal favorite, "Smoke from your fire pit is drifting into other yards. Please cease all bonfires." Considering the closest yard was 300 yards away and uphill, the note implied that smoke had developed supernatural powers just to irritate her. I almost wanted to thank her for assuming I had command over the elements. Stacked together, the notes looked like chapters from a novel she had been writing in fragments. How not to be a neighbor. Each page signed in the same neat, officious handwriting. Each complained a variation on the same theme, that my existence was a problem she intended to correct. The truth is, I'd let her win too often. Every note I ignored, every concession I made, was its own little surrender. I stopped lighting fires for a while. I kept Franklin indoors at night, even though he was unhappier than I was. At one point, I almost bought paint for the barn. That was the low point. Standing in the aisle at the hardware store, comparing shades of beige with names like Desert Pebble and Almond Whisper, and realizing I was shopping for someone else's approval. Mrs. Whitmore was the kind of woman who could turn apathy into policy, and I, against my better judgment, had become her perfect subject. I once thought living in a community meant borrowed sugar and the occasional backyard barbecue. Instead, I learned it meant surveillance. She had allies, of course, men in golf shirts who said property values the way preachers say amen, and women in identical sun visors, all nodding in rhythm like a cult. They met on Saturdays with clipboards, standing in the road, pointing at my cabin as if they were planning an airstrike. Once, I saw one of them measuring my grass with an actual ruler. I watched from the porch with my coffee, paralyzed by the absurdity. I didn't stop him because I wanted to see what the number would be. 7 inches. Too tall for his taste, apparently. One afternoon, after the 10th note, I tried to fight back. I wrote my own notice and pinned it to the community bulletin board. "Dear residents, please refrain from existing in ways that offend me. This includes breathing too loudly, walking without permission, and looking in my general direction." It was my small attempt at satire. By morning, it was gone, replaced with a new sign in Whitmore's handwriting. "Humor is not an excuse for rule violations." She always had the last word, and the last word was always typed, printed, and laminated. I told myself I didn't care, but the truth is, her disapproval clung to me like the smell of burnt popcorn, inescapable, no matter how many windows I opened. Even Franklin seemed to sense it. Whenever she walked by, he growled in his sleep, as if dreaming of a world without her. That morning, sipping bitter coffee, I realized I'd been domesticated. Not by my land, not by Franklin, but by a woman with a Lexus and a red blazer. I was behaving the way she wanted, even when I thought I was resisting. That was the genius of her tyranny. She didn't need legal authority, she just needed enough stationery. Still, part of me admired the efficiency. While most of us waste time with hobbies or actual work, she had distilled her existence into pure complaint. It was performance art, really. And like any art, it made the rest of us uncomfortable. I considered giving her what she wanted: beige barn, silenced dog, extinguished fire pit. Life would be easier if I played along. But then I pictured my grandfather shaking his head, muttering, If you give them an inch, they'll take your pasture. He didn't believe in metaphors, which made him all the more convincing. So I made a decision. If Mrs. Whitmore wanted a community battle, I'd turn it into a spectacle. I'd frame every one of her notes, hang them in the cabin, and call it a gallery, passive aggression, an exhibition. I'd sell tickets for $5 and serve free coffee, which would, naturally, be terrible. Franklin would be the mascot. Visitors would walk through, shake their heads, and leave convinced that madness had a face, and that face wore a red blazer. For the first time in months, I laughed at the thought. It wasn't victory, but it was something. The Lexus was gone from the driveway when I looked out again, replaced by silence. It was easy to pretend nothing had happened, but I knew better. The blockade wasn't an isolated act. It was a declaration. A siege. Franklin stretched beside me, paws twitching in a dream. "It's us, against them," I told him. He sneezed in reply. "Loyalty," in dog language. I stood, stretching my sore back, and looked at the cabin. The weeds, the peeling paint, the crooked porch railing, all the things she hated, looked beautiful to me. They were flaws, yes, but they were mine. Ugly splintered proof that I lived outside her beige empire. Then I heard it. The crunch of tires somewhere down the road. Maybe just a neighbor heading to the store. Or maybe Mrs. Whitmore, returning with a new strategy. I didn't know. But I knew one thing. The days of ignoring her were over. I set down the mug, squared my shoulders, and prepared for whatever came next. As ready as a man in yesterday's socks and reheated coffee could be. The crunch of tires on gravel is rarely a good omen. Around here, it means one of three things. Someone's lost, someone's delivering a package to the wrong house, or someone's about to make your day worse. On that morning, it turned out to be option 3. First came the silver Lexus, gleaming like a trophy I didn't want. It swerved to a stop across the mouth of my driveway. Again, as if Mrs. Whitmore were practicing siege warfare. She stepped out with her phone already at her ear, narrating my sins in a voice so loud it could have doubled as an air raid siren. "Yes, officer," she said, pacing like a newscaster covering a natural disaster. "He's threatening me. He refuses to comply. He's blocking community access. He's unstable." Behind her, another car approached. This one wasn't shiny. A tan county SUV pulled in slow, lights flashing half-heartedly, as if even they didn't want to be involved. Out stepped Deputy Clancy, who looked like a man in search of both a nap and a donut. I knew him, though I doubted he'd remember me. We'd gone to the same high school, back when he could eat 3 chocolate milks and 2 slices of cafeteria pizza without breaking a sweat. 20 years later, he had the same soft face, only now padded around the middle and accessorized with a badge. "Clancy," I said, waving like we were old friends at a reunion. He squinted at me. "Elliot? You ran track, didn't you?" "Ran is generous," I said. Mostly I fell forward repeatedly until the whistle blew. Before he could answer, Mrs. Whitmore swept forward, gesturing with the phone like a gavel. "Officer, this man has harassed me, threatened my vehicle, and endangered the community. He refuses to follow the rules. He's aggressive, unstable." Clancy held up a hand, the universal sign for "please stop talking before my head explodes." "Hold on, ma'am. Let's slow down." He turned to me. "This your property line?" "Yep," I said, pointing toward the oak tree and down to the lake. "Been in my family since the 60s. Got the deed framed inside. Goes 50 yards past the shore." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth twitched, like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "You can't just take his word for it." Clancy's expression didn't change. He had the calm, blank face of a man who'd seen one too many bar fights at the county fair. "Ma'am, if this is his land, then your vehicle is trespassing." For once, she didn't have a quick comeback. Her lips opened, then closed again. She looked like a fish trying to remember its lines in a school play. Clancy turned back to me. "Do you want to press trespassing charges? I can write it up right now." The idea was tempting. I imagined her standing in a courtroom, red blazer blazing under fluorescent lights, explaining to a bored judge how she'd bravely defended the community against the menace of my gravel driveway. It was almost worth it. But I also knew pressing charges would be like pouring gasoline on an already smoldering fire. And as much as I disliked her, I wasn't eager to turn my life into a courtroom drama starring me as the reluctant plaintiff. Not today, I said. Just need her off my land. Clancy nodded, jotting something in a notepad that looked too small to contain the stupidity of the situation. Ma'am, he said flatly, you need to move your vehicle. Whitmore huffed, like a child caught sneaking cookies, then stomped back to her Lexus. She slammed the door, reversed in a spray of gravel, and tore down the road, dignity flapping behind her like a loose bumper sticker. The silence she left was almost holy. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Thanks, I said to Clancy. He shrugged. This woman trouble for you? You have no idea, I said. She's been after me about everything, my barn, my dog, even the smoke from my fire pit. He smirked, the kind of half smile that comes from both pity and amusement. Better get your paperwork in order. Folks like her only understand two things, law and force. Those are my choices? I asked. Law or force? You don't have, say, civil conversation in the toolkit? Not with her, he said, climbing back into his SUV. He tapped the roof like a coach dismissing a player and drove off, leaving a faint trail of dust in his wake. I stood there with my coffee mug, alone again, wondering how my life had become a matinee show titled Idiot vs. Busybody, The Driveway Chronicles. That night, I dragged out everything I had, deeds, maps, old surveys that smelled faintly of mildew and despair. I spread them across the kitchen table like I was plotting a heist. Franklin, my dog, sat at my feet, tail thumping in what I hoped was approval. He seemed to sense I was finally taking the battle seriously, even if my weapon of choice was paperwork. Tracing the lines of the survey, I felt a strange comfort. My grandfather's shaky signature was still there, proof that this land wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't up for debate, no matter how many laminated notices Mrs. Whitmore produced. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like control. Not enough to sleep easy, but enough to think, I can fight back. I pictured the next confrontation. She'd show up, blazer blazing, notes in hand, voice shrill with authority. And instead of shrugging or arguing, I'd hand her a certified copy of the deed. A piece of paper older than her HOA, stamped, signed, and immune to her red pen. It was almost exciting, like imagining a sword fight, only with filing cabinets. That evening, I ate beans and cornbread on the porch, watching the sun bleed into the lake. The day had been absurd. Old high school classmates with badges, accusations shouted like Broadway lines, and a grown woman storming off like she'd been grounded. But it ended with me feeling steadier. Mrs. Whitmore had wanted to play by her rules. Now I knew I had my own. And next time, I'd be ready, not with threats, not with force, but with something even scarier: documents. If Deputy Clancy was right, and he usually was in the unhurried, half-bored way of men who've seen everything twice, then my sharpest weapon against Mrs. Whitmore wasn't a plow truck or my questionable charm. It was paper. Nothing terrifies a suburban tyrant quite like a stamped, signed, certified document. The HOA could laminate until their wrists gave out, but the county seal still trumped Kinko's Cominet. So the next morning, I drove into town to the county clerk's office, which looked like a government building, only in the sense that mildew had been allowed to run unopposed for decades. The air inside smelled of dust and bureaucracy. A ceiling fan creaked overhead, bravely but unsuccessfully circulating despair. Behind the counter sat Mr. Henderson, a wiry man with hair the color of a television tuned to static. His glasses rested permanently on the tip of his nose, and his face carried the expression of someone who had spent 30 years watching people try and fail to understand the concept of property lines. Well, if it isn't Elliot, he said, as though he'd been expecting me. Let me guess, this is about that HOA woman. The fact that I didn't even have to explain made me both comforted and slightly ashamed. Bingo, I said, sliding one of Whitmore's laminated threats across the counter. She's blocked my driveway, called the cops, threatened me with fines. I need proof that she doesn't own so much as a pebble of my gravel. Henderson chuckled. Knew it would come to this. Let me get the deeds. He shuffled off, leaving me surrounded by filing cabinets that hummed with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten disputes. When he returned, he carried a manila folder thick enough to serve as insulation. He spread the documents across the counter like a blackjack dealer. Here's the original survey, from 1962. See this line? That's your driveway. Clear as day. HOA jurisdiction ends half a mile before your property. She doesn't have a leg to stand on. I leaned over the yellowing paper, tracing the bold ink that defined my boundary. It felt like discovering buried treasure, only instead of gold doubloons, it was the legal right to tell a woman in a red blazer to get off my land. Can I get certified copies? I asked, already clutching the folder like it was a life raft. Already running them, Henderson said, sliding papers into the copier. Keep one in the cabin, one in your truck, and one in your wallet. People like her don't quit just because you're right. It was sound advice. Whitmore wasn't the sort of person who admitted defeat. She was the sort of person who laminated defeat, framed it, and used it as a teaching aid. Armed with documents that smelled faintly of both mildew and victory, I drove to my next stop, the office of Marlene Walker, attorney at law. Marlene had once handled a boundary spat for me when a neighbor tried to claim part of my dock by drawing a new line on a photocopy with a Sharpie. She'd laughed for about 12 seconds before writing a letter so sharp the neighbor folded like origami. Her office was small but intimidating, the kind of place where you sit straighter in the chair without meaning to. Marlene listened as I laid out the saga Lexus blockades, passive-aggressive notes, Clancy's visit, the whole humiliating circus. She wrote brisk notes on a yellow pad, never once looking up. When I finished, she leaned back, lips curved into the faintest smirk. She doesn't have a case. In fact, if she keeps trespassing, you could file a complaint for harassment, maybe even damages. Want me to draft a notice? Yes, I said, maybe too quickly. Something official, something that'll wipe the smug grin off her face. Marlene tapped her pen. HOA types thrive on intimidation. They throw around fake rules and hope no one pushes back. You, on the other hand, actually have the law. That's your advantage. Within half an hour, she handed me a letter so clean and merciless it could have been carved in stone. It cited my boundaries, the 1,962 deed, and spelled out the consequences if Whitmore or her board so much as set a loafer on my gravel again. It was, quite honestly, the sexiest thing I'd ever held that wasn't a sandwich. On the drive back, the folder sat on the passenger seat like a weapon. Franklin sprawled across the back seat, snoring, oblivious to our sudden transformation into a two-member militia armed with paperwork. I slowed when I reached the community entrance. Sure enough, the silver Lexus was parked there like a sentry. Whitmore leaned against the hood, sunglasses perched on her nose, arms folded. I didn't stop. I didn't roll down the window. I just let the sun glint off the thick folder on my dashboard. Her eyes followed it. For the first time, I saw something unfamiliar, doubt. Back at the cabin, I got to work. At the start of the driveway, I hammered in a new sign, private property, no unauthorized vehicles. The letters were black and bold, the kind used for prison gates and nuclear test sites. Then I parked my truck crosswise at the entrance, plow blade down like a drawbridge that would only lower for the righteous. By dusk, I was on the porch with a beer, staring at my fortifications. The lake shimmered, the crickets tuned up their evening orchestra, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. The papers were ready, the sign was planted, the plow was waiting. Whitmore could call the cops again, call her HOA board, call the Pope if she wanted. None of it mattered now. I had something she couldn't laminate, the truth. Still, I knew better than to relax. People like her don't retreat. They regroup, they plot, they laminate new strategies. But this time, I was ready. And if she wanted another round, I finally had an answer. Not rage, not force, just the sharp edge of pape. For 2 blessed days, the driveway stayed clear. No Lexus, no laminated notes, no HOA disciples in matching visors jotting down my crimes against suburban order. For 48 hours, the silence was so profound I could hear Franklin's snores echo across the lake. I started to think the storm had passed. Maybe Mrs. Whitmore had moved on, found a fresh victim with taller weeds or a trampoline visible from the road. That fantasy ended at exactly 12:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. The sound reached me first, the purr of a finely tuned engine, smug and expensive, like it came preloaded with judgment. I stepped onto the porch with my sandwich still in hand, and there it was, her silver Lexus, rounding the bend like a shark circling a wounded seal. She parked diagonally across my driveway with surgical precision, blocking it entirely, then flung open the door as if she'd arrived to stage a coup. She jabbed a finger at the private property sign I'd hammered in only 2 days before. "Take that down," she barked. "You're in violation of community regulations." I blinked at her, bread halfway to my mouth. "Mrs. Whitmore, that sign is on my land. It's as legal as apple pie." Her lips curled. "Oh really? You think your old truck scares me?" That was when the dangerous part of my brain, the one responsible for bad decisions and regrettable online purchases, clicked awake. If she wasn't scared of my truck, maybe she should be. I set my sandwich down, wiped mayo from my fingers, and strolled toward the barn. Behind me, she kept shouting, each syllable sharp enough to cut glass. Inside, waiting like a relic from another era, was my grandfather's Ford. Rust pocked its body like acne scars, but the steel snowplow bolted to the front still gleamed with menace. It hadn't seen real action since the blizzard of 2089. Until today. I slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and the engine groaned awake with a cough that rattled the barn doors. The sound alone silenced her mid-rant. I eased forward, the plow blade dragging sparks off the gravel. Sparks! Even Franklin perked up on the porch, tail wagging like he was watching live theater. Whitmore's eyes widened. "What do you think you're doing?" I rolled the window down. "Told you once already, you're not blocking my driveway again." She scrambled for her phone, camera up like a shield. "I'm filming this, you'll regret it." "Good," I said, grinning. "Make sure you get my good side." I inched forward, slow and deliberate. The plow scraped, gravel hissed, and a small ridge of stones gathered against her front tires. My heart hammered, like I was about to rob a bank. I had no real plan beyond, look terrifying, which, given my history, was ambitious. "You're insane," she shrieked, fumbling with her seatbelt. "I'm calling 911. "Please do," I said loudly, for the benefit of her camera. "Tell them how you trespassed on my driveway and nearly got plowed into next week." The distance between us shrank to less than a foot. I could see her knuckles clench the steering wheel, white as chalk. She hesitated just long enough for me to wonder if this was how my obituary would read. "Local man arrested for snowplowing HOA president in July." Then, blessedly, instinct kicked in. She slammed the Lexus into reverse, tires screeching, gravel spitting like fireworks. The silver beast shot backward down the road, disappearing in a cloud of dust. The silence left behind was so complete I could hear my own pulse. I cut the engine, hands trembling on the wheel, not from fear but from adrenaline. I had just staged a suburban duel, and for once, I'd walked away the victor. Still, I wasn't stupid. I pulled out my phone and dialed Clancy. "She blocking you again?" he asked, already weary. "Not anymore," I said. "Let's just say I encouraged her to leave." There was a pause, then the sound of him chuckling under his breath. "Elliot, I can't officially condone whatever it is you just did, but I'll tell you this. If she files a complaint, you've got the paperwork to back you up." "Exactly," I said, feeling almost proud. I parked the truck crosswise at the mouth of the driveway, lowered the plow blade until it kissed the gravel, and left it there, a barricade of rust and steel. A symbol. A monument. A not-so-subtle warning that if Mrs. Whitmore wanted to stage another siege, she'd have to get through 60 years of Ford engineering first. By evening, the sun was dropping over the lake, painting the water orange and gold. I sat on the porch with a beer, Franklin curled at my feet, and the plow silhouetted like a medieval weapon guarding the gate. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel fragile, it felt earned. But I knew her. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't the type to pack up her laminated notices and call it quits. People like her don't retreat. They regroup. They meet in secret with clipboards and casserole dishes, plot new strategies, vote on new standards, and emerge convinced the world owes them compliance. Let her try, I thought, raising my beer in a private toast, because now she'd seen me behind the wheel of that truck, sparks flying, gravel spitting, my grin plastered across her camera, and I suspected the image would haunt her long after the smell of burnt gravel faded. For once, the battlefield felt like it was mine. For almost a week, the gravel road remained suspiciously clear. No Lexus blocking my driveway, no laminated violations tucked under the gate, no HOA disciples in matching visors pointing at my grass. For 7 days, the silence was so profound I could hear Franklin snoring like a chainsaw across the lake. It was unnerving. Peace in this neighborhood felt less like a blessing and more like a warning label. The strike came on Friday morning. I found it waiting at the latch of my gate, a crisp white envelope, tucked neatly as though delivered by a passive-aggressive postman. My name was scrawled across the front in handwriting that looked like someone had written it while riding a roller coaster. Inside was a letter printed on what appeared to be official HOA letterhead. The font was Times New Roman, the color a self-important navy blue. Words like violation, fine, and lien leapt off the page in bold. According to this legally challenged masterpiece, I owed $500 for aggressive conduct, blocking community access, and unauthorized signage. Failure to pay would result in a lien on my property. I laughed so hard, Franklin started barking. A lien, I told him between gasps. They're going to repossess the cabin. Maybe they'll turn it into a clubhouse where everyone has to wear khakis. The absurdity was breathtaking. My property wasn't even under their jurisdiction. The HOA had as much authority over my land as I did over the moon. Yet here they were, issuing fake fines like suburban mobsters with a stolen printer. Still, the brazenness rattled me. I pictured Whitmore hunched over her dining room table, red blazer thrown over the chair, hammering away at Microsoft Word with the intensity of a Bond villain. I imagined her allies standing guard with casserole dishes, chanting, "Down with gravel, up with bylaws." That afternoon, driving past the community clubhouse, I spotted her Lexus parked front and center. She stood in a tight knot of conspirators, arms slicing the air, pointing toward my cabin like generals poring over a battlefield map. I half expected to see a scale model of my property on the hood, complete with a toy truck barricading the driveway. That did it. Enough was enough. On Monday, I returned to town with the letterhead of doom tucked under my arm. First stop, Mr. Henderson at the clerk's office. He adjusted his glasses, squinted at the page, and let out a wheezy chuckle. Well, they've really outdone themselves this time. Leanne, that's bold. Bold and entirely made up, I said. Don't worry, he said, sliding the letter into a file with the solemnity of a priest. We've got the surveys, the deeds, the maps. If they push this, you've got more paperwork than the Pentagon. Comforting, yes. But I needed more than dusty reassurance. I needed firepower. So my next stop was Marlene Walker's office. Marlene skimmed the letter once, then laughed a short, sharp laugh that reminded me of a paper cutter slicing through cardstock. This, she said, holding it between two fingers like it was contaminated, is harassment. Possibly fraud. Certainly idiotic. Can you make it go away? I asked. Elliot, people like her don't go away. They escalate. But that's fine, we escalate back. She flipped open her yellow pad, scribbling in neat, lethal strokes. I'll draft a cease and desist. If they trespass or send another phony notice, we file for damages. 10 minutes later, she handed me a letter so sharp it could have doubled as a guillotine blade. It spelled out my property boundaries, cited the 1962 deed, and warned that if Whitmore or her HOA so much as sniffed in my direction again, I'd drag them to court. I left her office practically giddy. Franklin stuck his head out the truck window, tongue flapping, as if he too sensed victory. The cease and desist sat on the passenger seat like a holy relic. When I reached the driveway, Whitmore was already waiting. Lexus angled off the road, blazer blazing like battle armor. You think that plow stunt scared me? She snapped, marching toward me with a finger cocked like a weapon. We're fining you $500 for harassment. I didn't flinch. Instead, I held up Marlene's letter like a shield. Funny thing, Mrs. Whitmore. According to the county and my lawyer, you and your HOA don't own a single pebble of this road. You have zero authority here. Zip. Nada. She froze. Her eyes darted across the first few lines. Her lips moved as she read, then faltered. It was as if she'd been handed a script in a language she didn't understand. This can't be right, she muttered. Oh, it's right, I said. Step on my property again, and I'll have you charged with trespassing. The sheriff already knows the score. For the first time, I saw her confidence wobble. Her shoulders sagged, just slightly, like a balloon leaking air. "This isn't over," she muttered, but the words sounded smaller, less like a threat and more like a bad habit. "Oh, I think it is," I said, voice steady. She turned, stormed back to her Lexus, and tore off down the road. A few hours later, two of her allies appeared at the edge of my property, muttering to each other, clipboards in hand, pointing at the cabin like ornithologists studying an invasive species. I didn't bother confronting them. Instead, I pulled out my phone, filmed them, and called out, "Smile for the camera. My lawyer loves evidence." They bolted like pigeons at a fireworks show. That night, I sat on the porch with Franklin curled at my feet, beer in hand, the lake glowing in the sunset. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt real. The Plow guarded the gate, the signs were posted, and I had a letter sharp enough to slice through Whitmore's entire binder of nonsense. But I knew better than to relax. People like her never leave quietly. They regroup, laminate new strategies, and return with fresh jargon. And when she did, I'd be waiting with paperwork, a plow, and just enough stubbornness to make her regret every drop of printer ink she'd ever used.